Welcome to today's webinar in the series 7 Universities, 7 Months, organized by the AUKUS Alliance, Action Line 4, the Multilingual and Multicultural University. From 2022, the AUKUS Alliance brings together 9 universities: Bergen, Granada, Graz, Leipzig, Lyon, Minho, Padua, Vilnius, and Wrocław. The aim of the AUKUS Alliance is to build bridges towards a shared future and thereby respond to the grand global societal challenges and to advance towards deeper European integration. Today's lecture takes us to Leipzig, where Dr. Caroline Allen will talk about the role of native speakers in the teaching of English for specific purposes. And I will now leave the floor, or the screen in this case, to Kerstin Gackle, also from the University of Leipzig, who will present Dr. Allen. Please, Kerstin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Osa, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm the coordinator for Action Line 4, Multilingual and Multicultural University, and work at Leipzig University. And today I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Caroline Allen. She is originally from the UK and has taught English for specific purposes since 2014. Her main focus is on the natural sciences and in particular medicine. She wrote her PhD on attitudes of medical students towards ESP teaching and how this knowledge can be used to create better course materials. She also coined the term native speaker security, which she will discuss more in her talk today. So now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Kerstin, for that introduction, and thank you and welcome also from me to my talk today on the role of the native speaker in English for specific purposes. Okay, here we go. So first of all, I'd like to just say a few words about the structure of today's talk. I'm going to begin by discussing my 2 main areas of focus and the sub-questions that come up. I'll then give a slight overview of the theoretical background that we need to understand the contextualization of the results that I'm going to present. I'll then just say a few words briefly about the data that I collected and in particular about the 2 sample groups that I looked at. And that will lead into the longest part of the presentation, which is the discussion of findings in terms of these 2 areas of focus that I'm about to outline. And that will bring us to a close, and I'll just give a few tips on how these findings have informed my own teaching, and perhaps if you're an ESP teacher, how you might be able to apply this also to your teaching. So first of all, the areas of focus. The first of the 2 broad areas is learner attitudes towards English as a lingua franca. And the lingua franca field is really, really broad with many different sub-questions. And I've selected the 2 main sub-fields of the English as a lingua franca field, and they are the role of the native English speaker as a teacher and the role of the native speaker as a standard setter in English as a lingua franca, and therefore English for specific purposes. This is often referred to in the field as native speaker norms. The second broad area of focus is on learner goals, how they form their goals, and what it is they are trying to achieve when they participate in an English for specific purposes course. And here the focus on the native speaker is whether they view native speakers as something to emulate or whether they're targeting something else. And this ties very closely into the idea of native speaker norms as the standard and whether they still are the standard. The overarching question that I'm trying to answer is whether learner attitudes are in line with the researchers and the research field, and if so, to what extent. My interest in the field began in 2014 when I started teaching medical English at a German university. And I had previously been a school teacher in England, and I noticed that the learners were very different to what I had experienced in England in secondary schools. And I also noticed that although it was a B2 C1 course, many of the learners were already at the C1 level, and in many cases C1+, and in some cases even C2. And so I asked myself what I could really help the students achieve in this course. And so I really wanted to find out more about their goals, what it is they're actually targeting, what do they want to learn, how do they want to learn it, and what they feel like their needs are. I also referred to the research on the subject, the theoretical background of teaching English for specific purposes, and I noticed that there was a slight deviation, let's say, from what the students were saying to what I was reading in the literature. And so I wanted to move away from an anecdotal view to something more empirical that would really help the students achieve their goals, and also to create better learning materials and courses that really meet the students' needs. So first, I'd like to define the terms that I'm using in this talk. And the three most important ones are attitude, which I'm using in the sense of it being a construct and one of the many individual differences that we see among learners in second language acquisition. Other individual differences here are, for example, aptitude, intelligence, learning styles, and motivation. Motivation and attitude are quite closely linked conceptually, but attitude is a really multifaceted term because of its three components. And it's important to point out that these three components affect cognition and behavior, can also be out of line in individual learners. So an example from English for specific purposes might be a chemistry student might recognize the importance of English to further their careers. They might believe that they need to improve their English, but on an affective level, they might feel as though this is an annoyance, they don't really want to participate in a course, and that somehow they feel disadvantaged and that it's an unfair extra layer that they have to work through to access their field. In terms of English as a lingua franca, I'm using a more broad definition here by Jenkins. It's a means of communication in English between speakers who have different first languages. Some of the definitions of ELF that we see in the field are more narrow than this, and they actually exclude the native speaker. I've chosen a definition that includes the native speaker. I think that the most important point is that the speakers have different first languages, and whether that first language is English, I think is important to keep in there, hence why I've chosen this specific definition. English for specific purposes, or ESP, is the teaching and learning of English as a second or foreign language where the goal of the learners is to use English in a particular domain. This could be an academic domain like medicine, law, any of the natural or social sciences. It could also be non-academic domains like tourism and aviation. And the goal here is that they can use English in the way that they need to succeed in their field. The terms ELF and ESP are really closely intertwined simply because if we didn't have ELF, if English was not the lingua franca of all of these fields, we wouldn't have ESP courses because we wouldn't need to teach English in this specific way. And so many of the sub-questions from the ELF field are also sub-questions for the teaching of ESP. So let's look now at the conceptualization of English as a lingua franca in a teaching context. And I think one of the really interesting aspects here is that when you look into the field, one of the first things that you'll notice, and this is also commented on in the literature, is that ELF is simultaneously portrayed as a threat and a benefit. And so we often see it discussed in these terms, the good, the bad. The benefit, I think, is something that we're all aware of, the idea that it makes communication within a field much, much easier. It removes the need for complex, expensive, and time-consuming translations. And it means that information can be shared really quickly. So when research comes out, it's instantly available to everybody who speaks English. The threat of lingua franca is based on the idea, a couple of different ideas actually. Number one, that the native speaker has an automatic advantage over a non-native speaker. So for example, Americans or Brits or Australians have potentially an easier path into their chosen career fields because they have the language already. They don't have to invest time and money into learning the language up to the standard that the field requires. It can also be a threat in the sense that, and I think this is something, again, we may all be aware of, that English words come into other languages. Many English words have come into German, and that can be seen in some ways as a threat, particularly to minority and smaller languages, but also to languages like German. I think even back around 15 years ago, of the top 100 medical journals, only 3 were published in the German language. And that shows that the threat is not just to the smaller and the minority languages, but also to large and important languages like German as well. So that's the threat and the benefit debate that we often see in ELF. Another term that you will notice if you get further into the field is the so-called native speaker fallacy. This comes from Philipson, who wrote a book entitled Linguistic Imperialism, and he discusses the fallacy that he describes as ludicrous, that we still regard native speakers as the standard setters in English, and that we think of English speakers, native English speakers, as proper English speakers, that in some way the variety of English that Americans and particularly British people speak is somehow better or more valid than some of the non-native varieties, which is sometimes referred to as world Englishes. In terms of how ELF should be taught, the idea of a native culture-free code is something that comes up really frequently. The idea that the English that we teach for ELF use is not so much a language of is more a language of communication rather than something that's identity related. And it's certainly not related to the cultures of English-speaking countries. So for example, any of the cultural connotations that I might have as being from England, or my colleague Kirsten might have as an American, we don't bring those into the ELF teaching environment. And this really raises a broad question of the ownership of English. Is English still the language of native speakers, particularly when we know that there are more non-native speakers of English than there are natives? So who does this language actually belong to, and who has the right to decide what is and isn't correct? Which really feeds into the question of who should be teaching this language. There is an argument that learners wrongly regard non-native speaker teachers as in some way second-class teachers, that the gold standard is a native speaker and a non-native speaker is second-class. And this is also backed up by the idea that native speakers have some kind of prestige as teachers. In terms of what we should be encouraging our students to strive for, native-like competence is something that's discouraged. The idea here is that it's not a realistic aim for many people. It's not a level that many students will achieve. And if they don't achieve it, then they will feel like a failed native speaker rather than a successful ELF user. And so that's why we're generally discouraged from encouraging our students from trying to achieve native-like competence. And just one thing I'd like to add, in terms of teaching ELF, one of the arguments is that the only situation in which it might, not necessarily is, but might be preferable to have a native speaker teacher is if the learner is planning to go to an inner circle country like Britain or America. And so in any other case, a non-native teacher would be equally as good and possibly in some cases preferable. English for specific purposes, or ESP, is really centered on the learner's needs, as I mentioned. Their immediate needs, i.e. what, in an academic context, what they need to get through their studies, and also in a future career context. So what they will need beyond their studies, perhaps the ability to conduct a presentation in English, publish research in English, and so on. So it's centered on their immediate and their future needs. And I think it's important to point out that despite what many people think, ESP is really not just about vocabulary. And I think if you're an ESP teacher yourself, one of the things that you will have noticed, if you ask your students at the beginning of a course, well, what would you like to achieve? What do you hope to learn? The first thing they will say is vocabulary. I want to improve my vocabulary. And in some ways, I think many learners would actually be happy just to have a vocabulary list. And actually, ESP is much, much more than just vocabulary. In fact, from my perspective, I think that the field is currently going through a shift, and we're moving also towards the direction of being the providers of academic skills, and that these ESP courses are almost becoming a natural home for some of the things that faculties don't have time or can't teach in the core subjects. And so a lot of what we do in ESP is not just about sentence level reading, at paragraph level reading, but actually how to understand an academic article, what we expect to see in an academic article, what to include if you're writing one. So in that sense, ESP is really moving into the direction of academic skills in some areas. In terms of the learning materials, authentic materials are highly recommended here. Textbooks tend not to be recommended. Although textbooks have improved in recent years, from my experience, they tend to be a bit too simplistic. And when we're teaching at a B2 plus C1 level, in many cases, textbooks simply don't challenge the learner enough. The next point that I've included here about why we shouldn't use authentic materials, and that means things that are, for example, research articles that have been published, or perhaps a TED talk or a conference talk or some kind of presentation. This comes from 1994, and so it's quite an old argument, but I think it really illustrates well some of the shifts that we've seen in the teaching of ESP. Widdowson here argues that authentic materials are normally created by native speakers from inner circle countries. Again, that means British or American English speakers. And even in 2009, they were still not recommended for use in ESP courses. And I think this highlights the fact that we've had this great shift with the internet and with globalization, that actually, if you're looking at authentic materials, one thing you will notice is that a really large proportion, probably even over 50%, is produced by non-native speakers. For example, TED Talks, if you look at the TED Talks, many of them are non-native speakers. And so in fact, the authentic materials that we have available to us now can really provide an excellent snapshot to our learners of how they can use English effectively in their field as non-native speakers. And the last point, just as my own personal interest here, the idea that learners find cultural content utterly boring. And we know that cultural content is not relevant in the teaching of ESP or ELF because it's probably not related to the domain in which they're learning. But whether they find it utterly boring is something that perhaps you can think about as an ESP teacher. Do they really find it boring? And that was something, again, that made me want to look at this empirically and collect empirical evidence on this, because that was not something that I was observing with my students. And so I wanted to clarify a little bit more where my ESP teaching stood within this field. And I think here are some really nice questions to consider if you are creating an ESP course. And this was from 2013, but I think these are still questions that we can ask ourselves today about our teaching. And how do we respond to the learner's needs? And crucially, what are their needs in learning English? They're really the experts on that. And so it's really important to ascertain that information from the students. What are their needs now and in the future? Whose Englishes should they learn? That relates to the idea of, should they be learning a native speaker normative approach to English or what? And really, I think that needs to come from the learners themselves. And also, what should be the goal of English language teaching in this ESP context? And again, I think it's the learners that really define their goals. And although we as educators may have firm ideas about what we think they should be targeting, their idea may be different than that. And I think it's really important that we listen to the learner voices on this. So just a few words on the data that I'm going to present to you in the following part. I conducted 2 data collections. One was quite a large group of over 130 medical students studying in Germany. They were all German, and they participated in a questionnaire, and then some of them in a follow-up interview between 2017 and 2019. The groups, the sample here was not particularly diverse. They were all German. The only thing that differentiated them was that they varied in age from 19 to 35 years old. So that didn't seem to have much of an impact, but also the range of semesters, that was quite important, because from a second semester up to the 10th semester, their exposure to English as a lingua franca was really varied. So for example, in the second semester, they may have read a few texts in English for their studies, but probably not much more. By the 10th semester, they will have participated in 4 practical placements that are mandatory for studying medicine. And many of them will have done these in large German cities like Berlin and Hamburg, and encountered patients who couldn't speak German and therefore had an ELF interaction there. And also it was reasonably popular as well to actually go and do one of these placements in an English-speaking country, particularly a so-called outer circle country like Kenya was a particularly popular one. So the more advanced the student was in their studies, the more experience and exposure they had to ELF, and that potentially changed their attitude about what they wanted from their ESP course. The other group was a much smaller group. This was an interview study only with a biological sciences master's students group that was conducted this year in 2022. The students were all in their mid to late 20s, but where there was a lot more diversity in the group was in terms of the nationality. So they were mixed. It was about 50% German, 50% international. And here we had a mixture, Greek, Vietnamese, and so on. And so that gives us a slightly more nuanced picture and might explain some of the fine differences that are visible between the two groups. And I've asked the question here, are our students really aware of the research field? I'm going to answer that in a bit more detail in a second. But this was something that was important in the preparation of the interviews. And that was that when I asked questions about native speaker teachers, native speaker norms, actually they weren't really aware of this. And so the benefit here is that the responses that I obtained from the students tended to be really spontaneous, much more based on an initial gut reaction rather than a considered response. So potentially the answers could be much more honest in that way and unaffected by bias. Okay, so let's have a look now at the information that I obtained from the students, and I've broken it up in terms of these areas of focus that I outlined at the beginning. And the first important point is they're not engaged with or aware of the ELF debate. So this threat benefit that I outlined at the beginning, it's not something that they've ever even thought of. A typical response to any of my questions to do with the native speaker, for example, do you think it's important to have a native speaker teacher, would be met with a response like, I've not really thought about it much until now. Do you think it's important to learn native speaker norms? Again, never really thought about it. So they're just not engaged with this. They generally don't see having to attend an ESP course and having to go through this extra layer of education in English to access their field. They don't see it as an imposition. In fact, many of them talk very positively about ESP. They talk very positively about English. They believe that it's very positively connotated. A lot of that is to do with the fact that they've all used English on holiday. So they automatically regard English as something to use in nice situations. But English is also a status symbol, and it's just part of being an educated young person. One of the other ways in which English is positively connotated, which really relates closely to the role of the native speaker in ESP teaching, is the idea that they regard themselves as being privileged for having English as a second language. And this was not something I fully understood, so I asked some follow-up questions. And what emerged here was that native English speakers only have English. So this stereotype of native English speakers only have English was really strongly held among the learners. And they said, well, native English speakers only have English, but we as non-native speakers have the privilege of having our first language and English as a second language. And we can easily jump in and out of English. So this idea of being disadvantaged as a non-native speaker in their field, medicine and biology in these cases, it didn't seem to have really become a problem for the students. In fact, they see it as a benefit that by definition, they will have at least 2 languages, as opposed to English native speakers who they believe will only ever have 1, which I thought was really quite interesting. Another point is that they were glad it's English. And again, I think this highlights the lack of awareness that they have of these questions in ESP teaching about the native speaker, because they talked about, well, I watch a lot of Netflix in my free time, I read a lot of books in English, and so because I have my English and I've got the exposure to it, I'm really glad that it's English that's the ELF of that's the lingua franca of my field. So not really recognizing that actually those 2 things go hand in hand, the cultural output in English and the fact that English is the lingua franca of many of these fields is not something that they've made a connection between. English is a tool, but not just. And so I heard it really nicely described also as a key to entering the field, but they also view it as slightly more than that. It actually has a quite emotional standing, which I'll talk about briefly in a few moments. So let's look at the learner attitudes towards the native speaker teacher in ESP teaching. And here I've divided it into the two sample groups because there is a slight difference. The first is that there's a really strong preference among the medical students for a native speaker teacher. And this is highly influenced by what they refer to as their school English. And I mean here their exposure to English in secondary education. It's certainly not a rejection of the non-native speaker teacher. They just think that the native speaker teacher is appropriate for them in their context. And what's meant by that is they've moved from secondary to tertiary education, and they're looking for a change to essentially mirror that transition that they've gone through from secondary to tertiary. They're looking for something different. They believe that it's appropriate for them, but it certainly was not a rejection. They don't see non-native speakers as second class. In fact, they talk about outside of ESP in the secondary context. At school, they talked about how actually it's much better to have a non-native speaker because a non-native speaker has a much more empathetic approach with difficulties that the native speaker will never understand because a native speaker has learnt the language in a totally different way. They've acquired the language in a much more naturalistic way. And so they believe that the native speaker teacher, the native and the non-native, are two different options, but not first and second class. When I asked, well, what is it about a native speaker teacher that you feel is appropriate to you in your context, the top answers were to do with accent and pronunciation, the sound of the language, not the language production, not the vocabulary, but just it sounds nice. And here, British was preferred. I would like to point out, though, that I had taught the students and I had also interviewed the students, so there may be a bias there. If it was repeated with an American, they may prefer American, but they also have many of the commonly held stereotypes of British versus American English that we've seen in research before. So, for example, British English is proper and formal and sophisticated, but American English is relaxed and cool. And so they view these two varieties of native English as being really quite different. Another really interesting aspect of what a native speaker would bring is the fact that the native speaker, by definition, is probably a foreigner. And so with this group where they were all German, this was considered to be a real advantage of a native speaker, that they bring their foreignness into the classroom. A, because it's just different, it's a nice change, it's different to the other lecturers that they have. But importantly, also that the native speaker will insist on the target language at all times, and that they don't have the option to break into German if they want or need to. They regard this as being a real positive. Again, it feeds into the idea that the native speaker, the native English speaker, will only have English. And that was something else that they also repeated. Well, the native English speaker teacher won't have our language, so we'll have to use English all the time, which I thought was quite interesting. The other thing that a native speaker, according to the learners, has is a relaxed attitude in the classroom, a relaxed approach to mistake correction. This, I think, is a really significant internal inconsistency in what they feel and what they believe, because they also talk about how important error correction is. The teacher must correct our mistakes with what they believe to be correct. And actually, interestingly, though, they regard the native speaker as being less likely to correct them, which I thought was interesting, because on the one hand, they want to be corrected, but on the other hand, an advantage of the native speaker is that they have a higher tolerance of mistakes or different ways to construct the same sentence. For the biological sciences students, the preference was still there, but it was a lot less strong. The focus here is on the competence of the teacher. And when I asked, well, what do you mean by competence? It was, well, the teacher has to be qualified to teach. They have to know how to teach and plan lessons, which I thought was a given. But of course, from their perspective, it isn't. The competence is also related to the fact that, and this importantly I should point out, was predominantly a writing course. They believe that the competence is also related to the fact that, has the teacher written academically themselves? Does the teacher know how to write a research article? Have they done it before? Can they teach you from their own experience? And so competence was really the number one factor. Again, this idea of stage and context being really important came across, that in secondary school, I wanted a non-native, but now it's better to have a native. And highlighting this idea that not every native speaker can be a good teacher, which I think is really interesting, because in the literature, we see not so much blanket statements, but it's more broad and less nuanced. Whereas when you ask the learners, it's not that they indiscriminately prefer a native speaker teacher. I think one of them used a really nice idiom, incorrectly, but still quite nicely. They described the native speaker teacher as, once the competence is there from the teacher, the fact, if they're a native speaker, that would be the cherry on the cake, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. So it's an additional bonus to these students, but competence must come first. Why the subtle difference between these two groups? I would hazard a guess that it's because the biological sciences students, had got more exposure to ELF. They were in their master's degree rather than their first experience of tertiary education. Also, the fact that it was a writing course predominantly, whereas the medical courses were a mixture of all skills. And also because I think they'd written their bachelor's thesis in English. So they'd already gone through a big hurdle in English, and they were really looking for refinement more than anything else. Okay, native speaker norms. And there are two slides here. So the first one, the learners view the native and the non-native speaker as two different things, just like the teacher, actually. Two different things, and it's context dependent. So fundamentally different. And again, here we see a bit of an inconsistency. So in terms of an interlocutor, they have strong preferences for either, but the justification is always the same. If you want to have an interaction that you can learn from and that you can improve your English from, then you want to speak to a native speaker. If you want to have an interaction in which you feel less anxiety and in which you feel more comfort, then speak to a non-native speaker. So two very different interactions is how they see it. When that shifts to activities in the ESP course, however, they want native speakers in listening activities because they find native speakers easier to understand in a listening context. So again, a slight inconsistency there. The focus on the sound of the language, the pronunciation, the intonation, comments like "it just sounds better." I think there's no one who can do it as well as a native speaker. So this idea of native speakers being the standard setters was very much present here. The idea that you can learn from a native speaker but feel comfortable with a non-native. There was, though, a really interesting differentiation between good and bad native speakers. The students certainly do not regard native speakers as perfection or the ultimate example to emulate. Actually, one student said native speakers make mistakes all the time. And so I asked, well, what kind of mistakes do native speakers make? And he pointed out that native speakers cannot get the difference between your, Y-O-U-R, and your, Y-O-U''R-E, and that's not a mistake a non-native would make. And I think that's absolutely true. I see that difference, that mistake among native speakers all the time, but among non-native speakers, it's not something that I've ever noticed among students. They can always differentiate between the two different types of your. Not all native speakers are good English speakers, absolutely. And I think the fact that the students have this nuanced view, they can differentiate between different types of native speakers, different levels of native speakers. This awareness is there. The fact that they do lean towards native speaker norms is not so much a prejudice against non-native speaker English, but it's really leaning towards good native speaker English, the kind of English an educated native speaker speaks. And so I thought that was a really nice indication that they actually do have quite a nuanced view of the English native speaker as the standard setter. On to the next part now, and generally there's no sense of disadvantage. This threat-benefit idea of ELF feeding into ESP is not something that the students actually feel. In fact, one of the students talked about how he imagined, and this is from the biological sciences student, so it was predominantly a writing course, he also described how he felt that he could have benefited from a course in German on writing. And so the idea here is that to be a good writer, it's actually a really learnable skill. And so the students don't feel, particularly in the context of a writing course, that they're at a strong disadvantage here to a native speaker, because they believe that the skill of writing well scientifically and academically is something that's learned rather than something that you acquire naturally or that you're just born with. Yes, native speakers are still the norm providers. I've left still there in the brackets because I question whether this will change. It's not something that feels like it's going to change, at least not immediately, among the learners that I spoke to. And I think one of the reasons for this is because they have a very clear justification about why they see a good native speaker as a standard setter. And this is because they are natural sciences students. And so when you have a discussion with them about the role of accuracy and the role of fluency in ESP teaching, they tended to say, well, we need fluency for small talk. We need fluency for having a drink with other English speakers. But we need accuracy for research. We need accuracy for our writing. We need accuracy in patient communication. And what they argued was that accuracy requires there to be a common standard. Something can't be accurate if there is not a standard for it to be compared against. And this is what they argued. And when I asked more about this, about the teacher correcting, the native speaker teacher correcting according to what they believe is correct, one of the students turned the question back to me and said, well, why would I bother coming to a course if the teacher wasn't going to teach me? And so they regard being corrected as absolutely vital, of course, which we would expect. But they also believe that, yes, the native speaker does have the right to correct them. But this is simply because their field requires accuracy, and accuracy requires a standard. And why should that standard not be the educated native speaker? It's not so much a prejudice or anything like that. It's more just, well, it already exists, so let's just go with it. In terms of learner goals, I was really surprised by the outcomes here. As teachers, we focus on the Common European Framework of Reference and which descriptors do they meet in the C1 and the B2 and how can they improve. This does not play a role at all in their goal formation. It's actually a really emotion-aid experience. Some of the terms that the students were using in the interviews were, I felt helpless and sad, embarrassed and ashamed because my English isn't up to scratch. And so for them, English is not just, it is a key to the field, but it's not just a key. It's really got this emotional aspect to it that I had actually never observed in teaching. And I asked about the minimum standard. What do you believe to be the minimum standard in your field? And in the medical field, it was, well, you need to be able to read an article, understand an article so that you can access research. And I asked, well, what do you want to achieve then? And they said that they wanted to go well beyond the minimum. I want to be good was a pretty standard response that I got here. I also asked, well, do you want to achieve native-like competence? And the answer here was yes, in many cases. Not all, but it did occur. So I asked, well, in what way? And the answers that they gave me showed that it's not about native speaker norms. When we talk about achieving native-like competence, the way that the learners see it versus the way that educators and researchers see it is actually quite different. They see achieving native speaker-like competence is not so much to do with output. It's not so much to do with forming sentences and using vocabulary, but it's about how they feel when they use the language. They talked about I want to speak English like I speak German. And what they mean there was that they want to be able to be absolutely sure that they're going to express themselves, first of all, accurately, and second of all, well, the second that they open their mouths. And when we talk about achieving native speaker-like competence, the students view that as more than language output. It's much more about this idea of comfort, security, and the security that the native speaker feels when they use the language. No mention of the Common European Framework of Reference. So that really didn't play a role in their goal formation. The biology students, again, it's important to mention that this was more of a writing course, but they first and foremost want to write reader-friendly texts, reader-friendly articles. They want to be able to use the language well, which they consider to be a learnable skill. But again, the idea of I want to be comfortable as myself really, really came across. Again, this effective response to using the language was also present. And I really love this quotation. This came from a Vietnamese student who had probably the best written English I'd ever seen from a student. And he talked about, I want to be an English speaker, not an English user. And so I asked a few more questions about, well, where's the difference between these two things? And he described his English education in Vietnam, and that in this context, it's much more, in his opinion, about becoming an English user, being able to use the language mechanically, being able to form sentences. And anecdotally, this is something that I know colleagues have seen among Asian students, is excellent writing ability, stronger than speaking ability. And he talked about the idea that he wanted to be really strong across the board, not just able to use English mechanically and effectively, but being able to use it well and in a nuanced way and feeling comfortable. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at it in terms of goal formation, is being an English speaker, not just an English user. And I think that feeds really well into the idea of wanting to achieve the native speaker security that a native speaker will naturally have in their first language. So on to the overall picture now, just to bring it all together to the main areas of focus that I outlined at the beginning. First of all, the native speaker teacher in ESP, there is a general preference for a native speaker, but it's not just about language output. It's about some of the ideas and the perceptions that they have about English speakers as people, that English speakers tend to be quite relaxed and they tend to bring something undefinable to the classroom. And in many cases, they couldn't always put into words what it was. It was more something slightly undefinable. But it's absolutely not that non-native speakers are second class in any way. It's a differentiation on context. And there was a strong belief that for ESP, the native would be better. But again, it's not a prejudice as such, and it certainly was not an exclusion, because competence really fed into there, that it has to be a competent native speaker first and foremost. The native speaker as a norm provider and a standard setter, yes, this is present, but they justified it very well, as I said, that there must be a standard for accuracy. And this was particularly the case in scientific English. It would be interesting to see whether this is also the case for social sciences. But there must be a standard for accuracy, so why not have the standard as a good native speaker? So let's just use what we already have, what's already there. Whether the native speaker plays a role in their goal formation, yes and no. Again, it's not about language output, language production. It's more than that. It's about how they feel when they're producing the language. They want to feel like a native speaker, even if the production is not there. Are attitudes of learners in line with researchers was one of the overarching questions. The answer here is no, not really. We do see a deviation here. And so it really highlights the importance of applying the theoretical background of ESP teaching and ELF teaching, of course, but also making sure that the students are consulted and engaged in the process, and so that we can have a better understanding of why they're attending a course. And this could help increase our course numbers and make sure that students stay in the course if they feel as though their needs are being met. And of course, I'm not arguing for just giving the students what they want all the time, but it's definitely a balancing act. And this is highlighted by the fact that the learner attitudes do seem to be quite out of line with the research field. So it really is a balancing act and simultaneously meeting different needs. And so implications for practice. So this is broadly how it's affected my practice. And perhaps if you're an ESP teacher, these are things that you might want to think about as well. The first one is exclusive use of the target language. If you're a native speaker, this is going to be easy. You just have to pretend that you don't know what they're saying when they speak to you in their language. Even if it's hard to put your pride aside and do this, I would highly recommend it. It works really well. And then the students will start translating things for you from their language because they think you don't understand any. And that's when you know that you've done this really well. Exclusive use of the target language also forces them to break this barrier that they have of the security of falling back on their L1. We don't want them to do that. We don't want our students to say, I'll just quickly tell you this in German. No, we want them to break through that and develop the security to have to say it in English. So target language must be used at all times in and outside of the classroom. So even in emails, it's great practice for them, and it simulates real life interactions that they will have in the future. And it also takes the fear away because they know that you're doing it in this context as their teacher, so that they don't have the fear that they will have in their future career. It's also really vital to have exposure to different Englishes. And here I mean native, I mean non-native, British, American, Indian, Chinese, all of the different world Englishes that we have. The students really need exposure to all of them. And in this context, I think it's really helpful also to get them to critique and evaluate the use of English. And you can do this with native and non-native examples. Ask them, show them a text, find a text that maybe is not particularly well written, and ask them if they like it. Ask them if it's reader friendly. Ask them to break down what they do and don't like. How could it be improved? You could show them a really outstanding presentation. TED Talks are really great for this. Show them an outstanding presentation and ask them, what did this speaker do? And it will help them to build strategies as non-native speakers. And this is particularly why authentic materials are so great, because it shows us real examples of successful English used by non-native speakers. Get them to critique and to evaluate these authentic materials, help them build strategies. Feedback. Students really like feedback. And this is something that I took from my training as a school teacher, was 2 stars and a wish. And the idea here is that we should give the children 2 positives and then 1 thing to improve. And perhaps we can't balance it like that. Perhaps it needs to be more like 1 and 1. But I had never realized how important it was until the students told me, we need to know what we're doing right. Then we know what we don't need to change. So whenever you give feedback, always positive reinforcement so that the students know what they don't need to work on. And again, it will help them build this security. They know that they've expressed something well and correctly. Tell them that they have. It will help them become more comfortable. You could also try incorporating some ELF research into the course and use it as a basis for discussion. Some text, Ken Highland has got some really excellent articles here, particularly in a writing course. This might be quite nice to just ask the students, well, what do you feel about English as the language of chemistry or biochemistry or whatever it is you're teaching? And that will also help you find out a little bit about their attitudes, what they think, and so on. So, and it's relevant to them because English is not just the language of their field, but also one of the boxes that they need to tick to get into their field. Think about how your subgroups of ESP students are different, and also the factors that will have affected their exposure to ELF, and that will really affect what they're trying to achieve in an ESP course. Age, stage, semester, time abroad, placements, nationality will all have an impact here. So how much time they've spent maybe in an English-speaking country, inner or outer circle, how much engagement they've done with research, have they written a thesis in English? All of these will have an impact on what they want to achieve in an ESP course. So find this information out and try to evaluate how much of an impact it has and where. And in terms of helping them achieve their goal of finding security, I would highly recommend, and I know this may sound very basic, but to create a really comfortable learning environment. And this is one of the things that was highlighted about a native speaker is really relaxed. It's nice to have a foreigner because they bring something different to the classroom. So try as much as possible to create a relaxed environment that is different to what they're experiencing in their everyday courses. So make sure that they feel relaxed coming to the course and making mistakes and being corrected. And this is where I personally do feel that although cultural learning is irrelevant for ESP, it could have a place in terms of this comfort factor, because in my experience, students do ask questions about my culture. The two most common questions that I get asked are, what do you think about the British royal family and Harry and Meghan? And how do you make a good cup of tea? And I'm not willing to shut those questions down and say, no, this is an ESP course, this is a native culture free code, just because that's what it should be. I think that it's always worth sacrificing, if you like, sacrificing a little bit of time to create a rapport with the students and let them have some enjoyment. Maybe focusing purely on chemistry or whatever it is a little bit dry. And so if the students express an interest in some element of cultural learning, I'm not saying spend the whole seminar on it, but 5 to 10 minutes talking about something that they've asked you will really help put the students at ease and create this really positive learning environment that now we know is so important in their goal formation, is the idea of achieving security. And so the last thing I'd like to say is that if you're going to keep one thing in mind, that the Vietnamese student who told me that he wants to be an English speaker, not an English user, is something to really think about applying to ESP teaching, is how can you help your students move away from being an English user to being a really natural English speaker and having many, many successful interactions and uses of English as a non-native speaker. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And if anyone has any questions, please do just ask them. I'm more than happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for
Thank
this
you.
interesting lecture. We will now give the public the possibility to ask questions or comments, and you will have to leave them in the chat. But before we get a question from the public, you talked a little bit about the different ESP groups or subgroups. So you mentioned that they were from different cultures and so on, but could you elaborate a little bit more about these subgroups?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, I have chemistry, biochemistry, and biology, and the students are really different, actually, in terms of how well they interact in the class. And there's a couple of things. Of course, there are personality differences. So the typical chemistry student does tend to be different from the typical medical student or biochemistry student. But one of the factors that I think has a huge impact is where they are in their studies. And so if you get students at the beginning in their second semester, they will be really enthusiastic in a way that sixth semester students, for example, might not be so enthusiastic. They're still at the beginning of their studies. And I think this is a really excellent time to teach ESP because of the enthusiasm from the learners. And I think that stage of study is an aspect, a difference between ESP subgroups that doesn't get enough attention. So that also comes in with subject knowledge. So in the second semester, for example, they're likely to have very limited subject knowledge. So what you can do with them is a lot less complex. And so I think that's one of the differences that I think is really vital. Where are they in their studies? And that will affect their motivation, their enthusiasm, and also the kinds of texts that you can do with them. And that's why I think the earlier ESP courses can take place in their studies, the better. the personality differences as well is much more anecdotal, but definitely there are observable differences between chemistry, for example, and biology.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And also, as you told us about the different nationalities and the different background they have in school and how they have been how they have had the learning environment in their home country can also affect this. And you also told us about that there has been some changes in the ESP during the 5 years. And is there anything else you would like to add about the other trends or changes in the ESP environment?
Yeah, I really think that ESP courses are becoming so much more about how can we help the students be good students and effective at the vital skills for academia. So reading and writing being the two main ones. And so a lot of what I do now is not just about what does the text say, what does the writer mean, but it's also about how do we construct a good abstract, which is not really purely English. It's much more about academic competence as well. And I think because many of these texts are simply available in English, the abstract tends to be in English and so on, we've just become a natural home for everything that can be taught in English that goes beyond sentence level and structure and so on. That it's also how to form a paragraph, which is not purely English, but it's something that the students need and that they're not going to get anywhere else. And so ESP is really diversifying in at least in my opinion and in my experience, that we're looking at helping our students with a much broader range of things that go far beyond the English language itself.
And you also talked about the culture differences. And of course, I can understand that how you make a cup of tea, maybe or maybe not be part of the ESP.
Yeah.
But for instance, if these students go to a conference, they will experience that in English you are much more polite than you might be in other languages. You always start, also in written communication. So could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the problems of seeing English as a native culture free code is that we risk if that's the way that it's conceptualized and that's the way that we teach it, that's not really the way that it operates in the real world. And so if we say to our students, hey, don't worry, it's fine, you can just write however you like, you can start an email with hey, that's fine, and they send an email starting with hey John, the reader of that email may not be aware of the fact that we conceptualize ESP and ELF as native culture free. And so I think that to teach ESP without any of this could also be a problem for the learner in the future, because they don't have any of these norms. That it's not only native speakers that have these norms, non-native speakers also pick them up. So and I think emailing is a really vital skill that we often overlook in ESP, and it's something that I often get positive feedback from students is, I didn't realize there was so much to writing a good email. And I really think that I can understand the argument that cultural content, in the sense of what do you think about the British royal family, is not relevant. But I think the cultural connotations that we have particularly in communication, particularly via email and in small talk, I think it's better if we do cover those, because otherwise we're not really preparing the students for the reality that comes. And I think that's where the difference lies between the conceptualization of ESP versus the reality of what they'll face in the future. And so I believe it's better to prepare them in a nuanced way, basically how not to offend anyone. Because as the example I gave, if they do start an email with hey, yes, that's a cultural connotation that we have, particularly from native speakers, but it doesn't mean that it's the right, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach them that that's not how we write a good formal email.
Thank you. There is a comment in the chat. Thank you for a great talk, from
Oh,
one person. Have
thank you.
and let's see if there are other questions or comments. We'll wait a little bit, and I can just say that there will be a new talk in June. We don't have the dates settled yet, but you could follow us on the Arcus website to see if there is when the next talk will be. And there is a question. I was wondering whether cultural content specific to the field purpose is relevant for ESP students.
It can be, I think. This was something that I found out particularly with medical students. So I asked them about, where do you see any relevance of culture? And the answer that came up again and again was, well, yeah, I want to know about the British healthcare system. I want to know about how the American healthcare system works. And that is cultural learning, but it's also part of a much bigger picture of where do they as future medics fit into a global system of healthcare, and how can we compare and contrast, and how can we improve the healthcare system that we have if we don't know what other people have. And so, yeah, I do think in the medical context, some cultural learning could be the difference between healthcare systems. And even if it's not something that they need in the future, one thing that they did express is, but it's really quite interesting for us as future doctors to know this. And again, I really do think that it's important to sacrifice a little bit of time to provide something that engages them. And if that's talking about different global medical systems, healthcare systems, then I think that that's fine. And so in terms of other fields, that off the top of my head, there's not really anything that's as clear as that. But yeah, healthcare systems in medical English was something that was requested many times.
And then there is a comment from Rossi B, a fascinating lecture, and another, thank you for the talk.
Oh, thank you. You're very welcome.
Yeah. So if there are no further questions, then we will thank you again. And also Kristin for participating, and also a big thank to Marina Fernandez Peña and her team at the University of Granada. They make all these talks possible. So thank you again, Caroline.
Thank you for having me.
It was very interesting to listen to you. Thank you, and thank you to the public for coming. Bye.
Bye.